Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. Aditya here. So, we'll continue our AWS comprehensive course. In that, we have already completed the Lambda sessions. Now, as I promised in the last Lambda session, I am starting a new topic, that is AWS API Gateway. So, now we'll see about this AWS API Gateway in depth, how it works in detailed hands-on sessions also. Okay, so in this session, I'm going to theory part about this AWS API Gateway and the things what you need to know about AWS Gateway to understand it better. So, without any further ado, I'm going to the topic. What is this AWS API Gateway? As the name suggests, AWS API Gateway is a managed serverless service. Okay, so similarly, Lambda it's a serverless service. This AWS API Gateway also is managed by AWS. So you don't need to worry about the underlying servers. You just use that service which was provided by the AWS to you. And this service helps us to build, deploy, and manage APIs. If you see, the main advantage and main use of this AWS API Gateway is to build APIs. Not only build, right? You can deploy those and you can manage those APIs using this service. Fascinating, right? You can use this service to build your own APIs without having hassle of maintaining the servers, spinning up your web server, and pointing out the route configurations and all. Okay, the use case is to expose our AWS resources as REST APIs, or we can create a custom API and expose as a REST HTTPS endpoints. So if you see this use case, we have AWS resources like Lambda or SQS, SNS, step function, batch processes. So we have so many AWS resources. And what if you want to access these AWS resources as REST APIs? So the savior is AWS API Gateway. You use this AWS API Gateway and access any of these AWS services through REST APIs. Okay. And what if you don't want to access any AWS service, but you have your own API which was deployed in an EC2 server and you want to access that API? So in that case also, you can use this API gateway which will give you an endpoint and you can map that endpoint to your custom API. Both the ways it will be useful for you, and if you want to create any REST APIs, the single point in the AWS services is API gateway. And moving on to the next point, that is these REST APIs are accessible from the public domain. So this is very important point you need to remember, because these APIs, whatever the APIs you are going to create by using the AWS API gateway, is accessible from the public domain. That means from the public internet, or from the internet, right? Any user can able to access our AWS resources directly and without using any IAM and all, right? He can able to directly access that. But the authorization security we will handle in the later part. But I'm saying you are directly exposing your AWS resource as an endpoint to the user. Okay. And next one, here we no need to manage servers. So when we use this API gateway, right, you no need to manage any servers. Why? Why you don't need to manage any servers? Because it's a serverless architecture and which was managed by the AWS itself. So you no need to manage any servers here. If you see this example, we have a Lambda. So since we have already covered Lambda, I'm using the Lambda as an example. And by using AWS API Gateway, how to invoke the Lambda, we will see now. We have this Lambda and we have our clients which are in public internet and they can directly able to access Lambda, right? By using a REST API. But what we need? We need API Gateway. By using the API Gateway, we can expose our Lambda function to the clients. So this API Gateway will do some proxy requests, right? Whatever request you send, that request should be sent to the Lambda as a proxy. Look, it's a proxy request. So that you will get the response back from the Lambda, right? The processing response back from the Lambda to your client. So this is how this AWS API Gateway will be used. And here I shown the example of Lambda, but it's not only for Lambda. It can be used for other AWS services like step functions and Kinesis data streams like that. So you can use any other AWS service in the place of Lambda and expose it as a REST API by using this API gateway. Okay, and moving on to the next point, that is, you may ask the question, if we have Lambda function URL feature, then why we need to use API gateway? So since earlier I showed the Lambda example, right? And to access the Lambda or to expose a Lambda as an REST API, why I need API gateway? Why could not I use Lambda function URL? Fine, you can use your Lambda function URL as an REST endpoint, but this API gateway will provide so many features, not like simply exposing a resource as a REST API. It will provide authorization, authentication, and so many features are there. We'll list it down here. Okay, we'll see those features now. But by using AWS API Gateway, you will get more privileges, more features, more options to secure your REST API. So we'll see now, right? The answer is it is not only just exposing our AWS resources, for example Lambda, as a REST API, but also provides a lot of other features like authentication, usage plan, development stages, etc. etc. So if you see, if you use this API gateway, you will get a feature called authentication. So which is not there in our Lambda function URL. So you can provide that authentication and you will have some things called usage plans and development stages. So these and all we will discuss in the later sessions, but this and all required for an API, right? This is like you are getting more customization and you have more control over your API. It's not like simply exposing your API like using Lambda function URL. You have more features now. Okay, moving on to the next point. Using this API gateway, we can integrate with other AWS resources also. So it's not only about Lambda, right? You can use Lambda function URL and expose your Lambda as an REST endpoint. But by using this API gateway, we can integrate it with other AWS resources also, not only for Lambda. For example, batch, AWS step function, SQS, SNS, etc. etc. Okay. And since in our serverless journey, I would see AWS Lambda with AWS API Gateway provides a complete serverless architecture for our REST APIs. So if you want to build REST APIs and right, if you want to build REST APIs and you don't want to maintain any servers, in that case, you could use the AWS Lambda as your backend process and AWS API Gateway for developing and exposing the endpoints. You could mix this combination, right? Because Lambda is a serverless architecture and AWS API is a serverless architecture. If you use two things, right, it is the easiest way of building an API, right, without using any servers behind. And moving on to the next point, that is AWS API Gateway supports WebSockets protocol. Fascinating, right? It's not only exposing your API as an REST API, but it will support WebSocket protocols also. What is WebSocket protocols and how these WebSocket protocols will be helpful for us? For example, if you are building a streaming application, right? You use this API gateway and expose an endpoint, and that endpoint could be used for your WebSocket, and WebSocket could be used for real-time streaming. Okay, so that is one more advantage of using AWS API Gateway. And AWS API Gateway handle the versionings also. For example, you created one version of API like Lambda, right? You created one version of Lambda and you fixed that version. And after that, you created second version, third version. But right, AWS API Gateway handle those versions, and you can switch between these versions, right? How we did in Lambda, we can switch to any version at any point of time, and those versions should be handled by this AWS API Gateway. And next one is API Gateway enables us to use different environments like dev, test, and prod environments. So you could simulate these environments in your AWS API Gateway and test your APIs, right? And this provides that feature also. And moving on to the next topic, that is AWS API Gateway provides authentication and authorization security features and more customizations. Okay, which is not there in even application load balancer and Lambda function URL. Okay, with respect to Lambda, I'm saying, but with respect to other resources, you could use application load balancer also. But when we compare between the application load balancer and API gateway, I would suggest API gateway because it have authorization and authentication features, right? Security features and more customizations. And the next point is API gateway provides us ability to create and maintain API keys, so you can create the API keys also, and even we can enable request throttling. For example, you created one API and the client is hitting more than what you expected, right? You are getting more load on your API, and you can specify the throttle limit also, so that if they cross that limit, you should send back the response as you reached the limit, right? You reached the throttling limit and you need to wait for some time or to access the API once again. Okay, and moving on to the next point, that is API gateway allows us to use common standards like Swagger or Open API import, right, to quickly define APIs. So we know the common standards like Swagger, right, to define the APIs for us to document them, we can use in API gateway also. And API gateway provides features to transform and validate the request in API gateway before sending to Lambda and clients. So here if you observe, right, you will have your requests and you will have your responses. So if you send a response or request to the API gateway, instead of directly sending that request to the underlying resource, right, it will do some transformations. So you will have that flexibility and customization ability to transform your request and validate your request. Not only transformation, if you add some validations at the API gateway level also. And when you got the response back from the resource, you can do some customizations and transformations and validations on your response while sending back to the clients also. So this was a beautiful feature provided by the API gateway, which was missing in the some other resources. Okay, and the next one is API gateway provide feature to generate SDK and API specifications. So if you want to generate API specifications, if you are using API gateway, it was very easy because there is a feature you can generate the SDK and API specifications also. The next one is API gateway provides feature to cache API responses. So to speed up your API responses, for example, to speed up your process for the low latency and high performance APIs, right? We could use AWS API Gateway. Why? Because it is caching your API responses. So if the same request come, right, it won't go back to the backend. It will simply send back the cached response, which will save a lot of time. That is one more good feature we can highlight here. There are a lot of features available in API Gateway. These things are missing in LB and Lambda function URLs. So Lambda function URLs is only with respect to Lambda. Don't get confused with Lambda function URL and AWS API Gateway. This AWS API Gateway is not only for Lambda, it could be used for all other AWS resources, and it will expose all these AWS resources as an REST APIs to the public internet. Okay, so moving on to the next topic, that is AWS API Gateway integrations. So we'll see what are the integrations available for this API Gateway. So the first one is HTTP. So you can create an HTTP endpoints. If you have any backend application exposing a REST API, we can use API Gateway to expose those REST APIs to outside world. For example, you have an API in your on-premise or maybe in your AWS EC2 environment, and you don't want to directly expose them using your custom domain and all, you could use this HTTP feature and use the AWS gateway to provide the endpoints to you, and these endpoints in turn hit your AWS EC2 instance, which is inside your AWS account. But you are not directly exposing your API through your EC2, where you need to configure your domain, HTTPS security certificate, those and all. Instead of, you just ask AWS API Gateway to provide the endpoint, and it will take care of those HTTPS certifications, those and all, right? That is one way. And it may be an application load balancer. For example, if you have an application load balancer which is exposing your REST APIs, right, which is in an EC2 instance, on top of it you can add application load balancer, right? On top of it you can add AWS API Gateway. So here AWS API Gateway will give you HTTPS URL, the REST point, and that REST point will hit your application load balancer. From the application load balancer you hit your underlying service, REST API service. So like that also you can do an integration. The reason of using API Gateway for exposing to public access was it provides feature like, right? Instead of using application load balancer, right? Even though if you use application load balancer, you need to create your custom domain and manage that HTTPS certificate, right? And you have to configure your route 53. Those and all you have to do. But if you use this API gateway, right, it will expose directly your service to the public access, and also it provides the following features like authorization and authentication, rate limiting and request throttling, and creation of API keys and caching the responses and more. I think we have discussed about these points in the previous slide, right? And this is what it provides. It provides a number of features which was fascinating, and we don't need to again go back and implement these features since there is an service which is already available. Then why you need to go back and use those features? You can reuse this service. And moving on to the next integration, that is Lambda. So you can integrate your AWS API gateway with Lambda backend. So here the Lambda backend, right? It is the most easiest way of exposing the REST API using API gateway. Since this API gateway, we know it will expose the REST APIs, but the most easiest way is using Lambda API gateway. Okay, and one more thing is both Lambda and API Gateway makes this architecture serverless because both are managed by the AWS and you don't need to worry about the underlying servers. And finally, here the AWS API Gateway will invoke the Lambda. So what will happen? You configured your REST API using API Gateway and you told my underlying backend, right? My integration type is Lambda. So this AWS API Gateway will invoke your Lambda. Okay. The third point is AWS service. So this is any AWS service. Okay. We can expose any AWS service as a API using AWS API Gateway. So you can use this AWS API Gateway and expose any other AWS service as an REST API. For example, you can invoke a Lambda by using this AWS API Gateway. You can post a SQS message. You can post a SNS notification and even execute AWS batch and step function workflows also by using this AWS API Gateway. Okay. And the reason for using AWS API Gateway for exposing AWS services as APIs was we can make it public accessible. We know the AWS services or resources need IAM roles, right, to access. But by using this AWS API Gateway, you can directly make your resources to the publicly accessible, and after that you can add your authorization authentication to make it secured. Okay, and authorize and authenticate and also rate control the request to the services. Okay, you can control how many hits are coming to the service and you can cache the responses, right? What and all, whatever I discussed in the previous slides, the same thing applicable here. So moving on to the next slide where we have an example, okay, where we are integrating our AWS API gateway with step function. We'll see how it will invoke this custom AWS service. So we are not going with any HTTP endpoint or we are not going with any Lambda. we're using another service which is not seen in this course until now. That is step function. So forget about what step function do. Usually do some workflow management, but just focus on the flow of the application. Here I have a client, and the client is nothing but the users. They are sending some requests. So once they send some requests, my AWS API gateway is set up to take those requests. So once the AWS gateway take those requests, I told right to pass that or to transform that request in my desired format and send it to some service called step function service. So this step function service, now what it will do is it in turn it process the request and send back response to the API gateway that service that request received. And after that, right, by using this step function, you can invoke a batch. So this batch process executes some business operations and creates some business reports and store it in S3 also. So likewise, you can use API gateway to invoke any AWS service. Look, here I invoke step function. You can invoke directly batch or you can invoke an SQS. Like that, you can use this API gateway to invoke any other AWS services. Okay, so by using this API gateway, we can able to integrate any other AWS service. Even we can call a Kinesis data stream service for real-time processing of records also. So instead of step function, here imagine a Kinesis data stream itself. So you can send request or request clients can send request in a real time to the data stream, and that stream could be stored as an JSON objects in the S3 also. So you can do that. And even we post a message to SQS for further processing transactions through SQS. So if you have some transactions and you are processing them using an SQS, and even you can send client request to the API gateway, and API gateway will send those requests to the SQS, and SQS will process those transactions also. You can do that way of integration also. So this is powerful AWS service which enables the integration with other AWS service easier, right? So this is the power of AWS API Gateway. You can integrate with any other AWS service easily by using this simple AWS Gateway feature. But it looks like simple, but it has so many features available inside it. And moving on to the next topic, that is AWS API Gateway endpoint types. So whenever you are configuring an AWS API gateway. So whenever you are configuring an AWS API gateway, you need to select endpoint, one endpoint, and we'll see what are the types of endpoints available and about them in depth here. The first one is, right, we can deploy the API gateway in three ways. The first one is edge optimized. So this is one endpoint type. So what is this edge optimized endpoint? This option usually enabled as default. This will provide low latency for all users who are using the API globally. Why? Because it is edge optimized. And we know that what is edge will do. Edge is available in all the edge locations. So whatever your API gateway code, right? Usually if you select the edge optimized, it is going to be installed or saved stored in the edge locations, so that right all the users who are globally accessing our API also they will get low latency. And since the deployment this API gateway will happens in edge locations of CloudFront, right, we know where the edge locations will reside in CloudFront. So all the requests are routed through edge locations. So since edge locations are faster and it will try to process locations right in the nearest locations, and it will try to process in the nearest servers, you will get the response quickly. So the latency will be lower here. And even the AWS gateway resides in one region. So even though your AWS gateway created in some other region, if you enable the edge optimized endpoint, it will be supplied to the all CloudFront distribution edge locations, so that your responses will be quicker. You have very low latency. And moving on to the second endpoint type, that is regional. So we have covered the edge optimized, Now, if you see the regional, if we explicitly provide the endpoint type as regional, means we are specifying the endpoint belongs to a particular region. Obviously, we are saying this particular endpoint belongs to a particular region. That's why it is called regional. So the resources within the same region can able to access the API, but not the resources from the other regions. Obviously. So you created this API gateway in US East 1, but you are trying to access same resources from the US East 2. You can't access because you said it's a regional. Okay. So in this case, right, what we have to do is we have to use CloudFront manually to expose it globally. So in these cases, if you select a regional endpoint, right, we need to use the CloudFront and you need to configure those CloudFront edge locations and all where you want to expose your APIs, right? Then you need to do some manual work there. But the one advantage of using the regional endpoint with CloudFront is we will get more control over the caching strategies and distributions. So if you select the edge optimized way, it will by default it will do right behind the scenes it will do all the work for us. But when we select it regional, we know it won't, the resources only belongs to will be accessed from that region itself, but from other region these resources won't be available. So there will be some latency issues. But you can use the CloudFront even set up manually and expose these API gateways are your APIs globally, right? Using edge functions, edge locations, but right, you will have more control now because you can control over the caching strategies and distribution strategies because you are doing it in manually. But if you selected the edge optimized option, there AWS is doing all the work for you. So you don't need to worry about the caching strategies and distribution, but you don't have control over it also. And moving on to the last endpoint type, that is private. So what is this private endpoint type, right? So as the name suggests, private endpoints are only accessed from the VPC. So whatever AWS API gateway services you are creating inside an VPC, they comes under private endpoints. So these endpoints you can't directly access from the outside. You can only able to access inside of your VPC. Okay. And to access those, you need to create this VPC endpoints, that is elastic network interfaces to access them. Okay. And also the other resources in VPC to access the private APIs, right, which was created through AWS API Gateway, then we need to define resource-based policy of AWS API Gateway to allow the resources to access it. Obviously, because you created an API inside an VPC. Now, the other resources which are resides inside the VPC trying to access that API, and you created an VPC endpoint, that is elastic network interface. Even though the resources, right, which are trying to access this elastic network interface should be listed in the resource based policy of the AWS API Gateway, then only AWS API Gateway will allow them to access or to hit it. Okay, so always remember this private thing which requires this VPC endpoints and also resource based policy updates. Okay, so if you remember the Lambda function URL, you don't have the private link, but this is the private link you have available now. So you can use this private link. And these are the three types of endpoint types, and these three types will be helpful based on your use case. So you can experiment these and deploy your APIs, right? You have three types of API gateways here. And moving on to the next topic, that is AWS API Gateway security. So when it comes to security, how AWS API Gateway works, we'll see now. The first one is API Gateway enables the user authentication through the following. The first one is IAM roles. So by using API Gateway, you can authenticate users first by using IAM roles itself. So usually for resources within the AWS, we'll use these IAM roles to access the API Gateway. So definitely for internal applications only, right? Since this API Gateway resides in an AWS account and you have some other resources in the same account, right? Definitely those resources will have IAM roles. By using those IAM roles, you can able to directly access this API Gateway. APIs. And the next one is, what about the users outside AWS? Definitely. So these are inside the AWS internal applications. What about external applications or external users? Okay. So for this purpose, we can use Cognito. So this is one more AWS serverless architecture service which can be used to store the users. So which was acts as an identity to the external web users. So here we have IAM role as an identity so that we can able to access the API gateway. But what about external users? They need to use the Cognito feature or service. Okay, and if they're registered in this Cognito service, they can able to identify as an valid user so that they can access AWS API gateway. Okay, so it's a managed service provided by AWS for managing users. What if you want to write your own authorization logic? So you don't want to use Cognito, you want to write your own authorization logic. For example, you have your own set of service where you are maintaining your users. So then you don't need to use the Cognito also. You can write your own authorization logic. So in this case, we can use a custom authorizer in API gateway. So in the API gateway, we'll have an option called feature called custom authorization. So this custom authorizer, right, where you can write your own implementation of your authorization logic there. So you can connect your own database and check about the user authentication by getting the request from the API gateway and validate them and provide response back to the user. Like that, you can authorize, authenticate your users. So these are the types, right? You have IAM roles and you have Cognito for the external users. Even you want your own customization, you have custom authorizer. Okay, moving on to the next point, that is AWS API Gateway will provide API endpoints with HTTPS protocol. Obviously, right? If you create an API endpoint in AWS API Gateway, it will give you the endpoint starting with HTTPS only. So that is a secured way of accessing an API, right? But if you want to use your own domain names, then definitely, right? Sometimes our organizations use their own names, their own domains names. They don't want to expose their APIs in the name of AWS, right? They want to expose their APIs with their own domain names. So in that case, how can you handle? Here, definitely, API Gateway will give some API endpoints, which will end with some AWS dot on something something. And what if I want to use my custom domain here? We'll see how to configure that. For that, right, definitely if you want to create a custom domain, you need an Route 53 service. In the service, you need to create a CNAME and alias and your domain. And if you don't know about Route 53 and CNAME, alias records and all, in the future, where we are going to make course on a Route 53 service, there you will get the more understanding. But as of now, just remember you need a domain, right? Domain means your own URL. That thing you need to register in the Route 53, and you need to assign a CNAME and alias records to your domain. Then only that will work. So just remember that. And after that, right, you need an ACM. ACM means AWS Certificate Manager. So by using this AWS Certificate Manager, right, you can use HTTP security for your domain. So definitely if you remember or if you already worked on the web application, you know, right, HTTPS requires a certificate and the certificate we need to manage somewhere else. Usually in our web servers, we will manage that. But here you store that service or your certificate in this ACM, right, AWS Certificate Manager. By using this certificate, it will provide you the HTTPS endpoint. And these HTTP endpoints will be added with your domain, and finally your domain will be secured now. Okay, so your domain URL with starts with HTTPS endpoints once you stored your HTTPS or your certificate in this certificate manager. Okay, and here the important point you need to note is based on the endpoint, you need to store your certificate in proper places. Okay, so if you are using edge optimized endpoint, then definitely this certificate must be stored in US East 1 region. Okay, because this is edge optimized, so you need to always keep your SSL certificate in this US East 1 region. And if you are using regional endpoint, not edge optimized endpoint, That means you have to specify or you have to store, right, this certificate in the same region where you are created your AWS API gateway. Okay, so just keep in mind when you are working with your custom domain, you have to go for Route 53, create your domain URL and create a CNAME alias and also store your SSL certificate in the ACM, and based on the endpoint type you need to store the certificate in different regions. Use the AWS Gateway API itself, the endpoints which was provided by the AWS API Gateway. You don't want custom domain. It will be very easier to you because it will give you all these things. It will do all this customization, right? Domain creation and storing, make it as a secured by using the SSL certificate. Those and all it will be taken care by the AWS itself, the AWS API Gateway itself. That is about AWS API Gateway. I know this is exhaustive and more information, right? But this is required to know about the AWS API Gateway. These and all features, securities, and endpoints which was provided by the AWS API Gateway. So this is about AWS API Gateway, and I hope you understand the concept. If you like my video, like, share, and subscribe, and let me know in the comments if you want to learn further more topics. Thanks for watching my videos. Bye.